It rarely begins with a visible rupture. More often, the shift starts in small adjustments that seem rational at the time. Incentives change first, quietly, almost politely. A lender relaxes a standard, just slightly. A government extends a program meant to be temporary. A central authority reinterprets its own limits, not to break them, but to adapt to circumstances that feel exceptional. Each step is defensible in isolation. Each step carries its own logic. Over time, these adjustments accumulate into something larger than any single decision. The system begins to rely on conditions that did not previously exist. What was once extraordinary becomes routine. What was once a safeguard becomes an obstacle, and then eventually an inconvenience. This transition is not announced. It is not debated in full view. It emerges through practice. For a long period, the surface remains calm. Markets continue to function. Institutions continue to operate. Confidence does not disappear. It merely becomes dependent on a new set of assumptions. The language used to describe stability remains unchanged, even as the underlying structure begins to shift. If one were to observe closely, the signals are present. They appear in the form of subtle distortions, prices that move without clear cause, obligations that are extended rather than settled, growth that persists but feels increasingly disconnected from production. These are not immediate warnings. They are, instead, early indications that the system is beginning to behave differently than before. History tends to remember collapses as sudden events, a date, a moment, a failure that can be named. But the conditions that produce those moments are always gradual. They form in the background, long before the visible break. In the late stages of many past systems, a similar pattern can be observed. The Roman Empire, in its later centuries, did not collapse in a single year. Its financial structure evolved slowly, responding to pressures that seemed manageable at the time. Coinage was adjusted, obligations expanded, administrative complexity increased. Each measure was intended to preserve stability. Each measure, in isolation, appeared reasonable. But over time, the system began to depend on its own modifications. It required constant adjustment to maintain the appearance of continuity. Stability was no longer a natural outcome of the structure. It became something that had to be actively sustained. A similar pattern emerged in early modern Europe. States facing prolonged conflict began to experiment with new forms of financing. Debt instruments expanded. Central authorities became intermediaries between present needs and future obligations. At first, this innovation allowed for flexibility. It extended capacity without immediate consequence. But it also introduced a new dependency. The system no longer required balance in the present. It required confidence in the future. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. When a system relies on present balance, its limits are visible. When it relies on future confidence, its limits become abstract. They are not defined by what exists, but by what is believed to be possible. Over time, this belief becomes embedded in the system itself. It shapes behavior. It influences decisions. It allows for expansions that would not have been considered under earlier constraints. The shift is not inherently unstable. In many cases, it produces long periods of apparent prosperity. Activity increases. Opportunities expand. The system appears more dynamic, more capable, more resilient. But beneath that appearance, a quiet transformation has taken place. The foundation has changed from something measurable to something conditional. This is where the pattern begins to matter. Because once a system depends on conditions rather than constraints, it must continuously manage those conditions. It must ensure that confidence persists. It must prevent disruptions, that could cause participants to reassess their assumptions. This does not require control in the traditional sense. It requires continuity. The system must keep moving, not necessarily forward, but without interruption. Interruptions introduce questions. Questions introduce doubt. And doubt, once it spreads, does not remain contained. In the present moment, the surface still reflects stability. Institutions function. Policies are implemented. Adjustments are made with the same measured language that has always accompanied them. There is no single event that signals a break, but the structure beneath has already evolved. What once operated within defined limits now operates within managed expectations. What once required balance now requires maintenance. And maintenance, by its nature, does not resolve underlying pressures. It redistributes them over time. This is the stage where systems appear strongest. They have adapted. They have survived earlier strains. They have developed mechanisms to extend their own continuity. But it is also the stage where their dependency is greatest. Because the system no longer rests on what it produces, but on what it can continue to promise. That difference is rarely noticed in real time. It becomes clear only in retrospect, when the conditions that supported those promises begin to shift. For now, those conditions still hold. The structure that emerges from this kind of transition is not accidental. It follows a pattern that has appeared in different forms across centuries. The details change, the institutions evolve, the language becomes more refined, but the underlying mechanism remains remarkably consistent. At its core, every large system must answer the same question: how to fund its own continuity. In earlier periods, this question was constrained by immediacy. Revenue had to be collected before it could be spent. Resources had to be extracted before they could be deployed. The limits were visible, and because they were visible, they imposed discipline. But as systems grow more complex, they begin to separate the act of spending from the act of funding. This separation is not inherently problematic. In fact, it allows for expansion, for flexibility, for the smoothing of shocks that would otherwise be disruptive. It creates room for growth that would not be possible under rigid constraints. The mechanism that enables this separation is always some form of future claim. It may take the shape of debt, or credit, or promises embedded within institutions. Regardless of its form, it allows the system to operate beyond its immediate means by borrowing from what has not yet occurred. At first, this is a tool. It is used selectively, often in response to specific pressures. War, crisis, or structural change can justify its use. And in those moments, it can be highly effective. It provides continuity when continuity would otherwise be threatened. But over time, the use of future claims tends to expand. What begins as an exception becomes a standard practice. Systems learn that they can sustain higher levels of activity by extending their reach into the future. The constraint of the present becomes less binding, and the horizon of possibility appears to widen. This is where the pattern begins to take shape. As reliance on future claims increases, the system must ensure that those claims remain credible. Credibility, in this context, is not simply a matter of accounting. It is a matter of perception. Participants must believe that the future will deliver what has been promised. That belief becomes the foundation upon which the system rests. To maintain that belief, the system begins to prioritize stability above all else. Not stability in the sense of equilibrium, but stability in the sense of continuity. The flow must continue. The obligations must be rolled forward. The appearance of normalcy must be preserved. This introduces a subtle but important shift. The system is no longer optimizing for long-term balance. It is optimizing for short-term continuity. Historically, this shift can be observed in various forms. In 18th century France, the monarchy relied increasingly on complex financial instruments to sustain its expenditures. Revenue collection was inconsistent, but obligations continued to grow. The system depended on the ability to refinance, to extend, to maintain confidence among creditors. For a time, this worked. The state functioned. The apparatus of power remained intact. But the underlying structure became increasingly fragile. It was not the size of the obligations alone that created vulnerability, but the dependence on continuous renewal. When confidence faltered, even slightly, the system had little room to adjust. A similar dynamic appeared in the late stages of the Spanish Empire. Vast inflows of silver created an initial surge in capacity, but over time the financial system adapted to that influx in ways that were not sustainable. Commitments expanded, expectations rose. The structure became dependent on a flow that could not be guaranteed. When that flow weakened, the consequences were not immediate collapse, but a gradual unraveling of the system's ability to meet its own expectations. These examples are not identical, but they share a common structure. The system extends itself into the future, builds its present around that extension, and then becomes dependent on the continuation of conditions that cannot be fully controlled. In modern systems, the scale is larger, the mechanisms more sophisticated, and the coordination more precise. Central institutions play a more active role in managing conditions. They can influence the cost of borrowing, the availability of liquidity, the perception of risk. This adds a layer of resilience that earlier systems did not possess. But it does not remove the underlying pattern. If anything, it refines it. Because the presence of these mechanisms allows the system to extend further, to operate with greater confidence in its ability to manage disruptions. The horizon moves outward. The constraints become less visible. The dependence on managed conditions becomes more deeply embedded. Numbers, in this context, are often cited to demonstrate capacity. Ratios, growth rates, projections. They provide a framework for understanding scale, but they can also obscure the structural relationship between present activity and future obligation. A system can carry a large volume of commitments as long as those commitments can be continuously maintained. The threshold is not defined by a specific number, but by the system's ability to sustain the conditions that support those commitments. This is why periods of apparent strength can coincide with increasing fragility. The system is functioning. It is meeting its obligations. It is expanding. But it is doing so under a set of assumptions that must remain intact. Those assumptions are rarely questioned during periods of stability. They become part of the background, part of the environment in which decisions are made. In the present, similar dynamics can be observed, though they are framed in contemporary language. Policies are designed to support growth, to stabilize markets, to ensure liquidity. Instruments are created to distribute risk, to extend timelines, to smooth volatility. Each of these functions has its purpose. Each contributes to the system's ability to continue operating, but collectively, they also reinforce a particular structure, one in which the present is supported by expectations about the future, one in which continuity depends on the maintenance of conditions rather than the resolution of imbalances. This is not a flaw in design. It is a characteristic of systems that have evolved to manage complexity. And it is precisely this characteristic that has appeared in different forms before every major structural break, not as a cause in isolation, but as a condition that makes certain outcomes possible, What gives these systems their peculiar character is not the moment when they fail, but the long period during which they do not. The continuity itself becomes part of the structure. Each year that passes without disruption reinforces the belief that disruption is unlikely, or at least manageable. The mechanisms designed to absorb stress begin to feel permanent. But they are not permanent, they are conditional. The transition from gradual strain to visible consequence is rarely linear. It does not unfold in proportion to the pressures that have accumulated. Instead, it follows a different rhythm, one that is difficult to perceive while it is happening. For long stretches, the system adapts. Pressures emerge and responses are introduced. Adjustments are made to maintain equilibrium, or at least the appearance of it. These adjustments can take many forms. Policies are extended, timelines are lengthened, definitions are revised. Each response is calibrated to the conditions of the moment. Each is intended to preserve continuity. And for a time, they succeed. This creates a particular kind of stability. Not the stability of balance, but the stability of ongoing adjustment. The system remains functional, not because its underlying tensions have been resolved, but because they have been redistributed in ways that allow operations to continue. This is the phase where most observers feel reassured. The system has encountered challenges before and has continued to operate. It has demonstrated resilience. It has proven adaptable. But this resilience has a specific nature. It is not the resilience of a structure that can absorb shocks without changing. It is the resilience of a structure that changes in order to absorb shocks. Over time, these changes accumulate. They alter the internal relationships within the system. Dependencies deepen. Margins narrow. The space for independent movement becomes more limited. At a certain point, the system becomes highly sensitive to conditions that it once would have absorbed without difficulty. Small disturbances begin to have disproportionate effects, not because they are inherently large, but because the structure has less capacity to adjust without consequence. This sensitivity does not announce itself. It reveals itself through inconsistencies. A policy that once produced predictable outcomes begins to yield mixed results. A market that once stabilized quickly takes longer to settle. An intervention that once restored confidence now requires reinforcement. These are not failures in the conventional sense. They are signals that the system's internal dynamics have shifted. Historically, this phase has often been misinterpreted. It is seen as a temporary irregularity, a deviation from an otherwise stable trajectory. Efforts are made to correct it, to bring the system back to its previous state. But the previous state no longer exists. The system has moved into a different configuration, one in which the relationships between its parts have changed. The tools that were effective in earlier stages are still used, but their effects are less certain. This is where the idea of unpredictability begins to emerge. Not because events are random, but because the system's response to events has become less consistent. The same action can produce different outcomes depending on the context in which it is applied. Triggers in this environment are often misunderstood. They are seen as causes, when in reality they are catalysts. They reveal conditions that were already present. In 2008, it was not the existence of a specific financial instrument that created the crisis. It was the accumulation of dependencies, the layering of assumptions, the reliance on continuous functioning across interconnected parts of the system. The instrument merely exposed those conditions. The same can be said of earlier periods. The immediate cause of disruption is rarely the underlying reason. It is the point at which the system's capacity to manage its own structure is exceeded. In the present, the conditions that define this phase are visible, though they are not always recognized as such. Institutions operate with increasing coordination. Policies are designed with awareness of their broader impact. Interventions are introduced with the intention of maintaining stability across multiple domains. This creates an environment that feels managed, even controlled. Variability is reduced. Extremes are softened. The system appears to move within a narrower range of outcomes. But this narrowing has a consequence. It reduces the system's exposure to smaller disruptions, which, in turn, reduces its opportunity to adjust gradually. Pressures that might have been released in smaller increments remain within the system, accumulating over time. When they do emerge, they tend to do so more abruptly. This is not a matter of timing in the precise sense. There is no fixed point at which the transition must occur. But there are periods in which the alignment of conditions makes such transitions more likely. These periods are defined not by a single metric, but by the convergence of multiple factors. The extent of future commitments, the reliance on continuous renewal, the sensitivity of the system to changes in perception, the degree to which stability depends on active management. When these factors align, the system enters a phase where continuity becomes more difficult to sustain without increasingly significant intervention. This is where the quiet pattern that has preceded past collapses becomes relevant again, not as a prediction, but as a recognition. Because across different eras, different institutions, and different scales, the sequence has remained consistent. A gradual shift from constraint to condition, a growing reliance on the future to sustain the present, an extended period of managed stability, and then a transition in which that stability can no longer be maintained in the same way. The specific form of that transition cannot be known in advance. It may take the shape of financial disruption, institutional realignment, or a redefinition of the system's operating principles. But the underlying movement is familiar. And in that sense, the alignment observed around 2027 does not point to an event, but to a phase. A point in the cycle where the accumulated conditions begin to matter more than the mechanisms designed to manage them. It is not the end of a system, but the moment when its existing structure is no longer sufficient to carry it forward unchanged. That moment, when it arrives, is rarely recognized immediately. It is understood only later, when the continuity that once seemed assured begins to feel conditional again.